The story is in 1 Samuel, the 16th chapter, and I invite you to read it at your leisure. It's a good story about an election campaign, about, in fact, almost exactly 3,000 years ago, the results of which were a little like waking up in the morning and learning that Kucinich is president of the United States. You all know who he is, I trust. Only back then, they were going after a king, not a president, and they had perhaps a more efficient way to pick one than we do. Just hire a local prophet to go find one. No year-long campaigns, no millions for television, no election day organization, just old Samuel and the confidence that he will discover the will of God in the matter. And clearly they needed a new one. Saul, handsome and tall, had proved nonetheless to be an unmitigated disaster, a great general. He had won a stunning victory over the Amalekites, but then he made the mistake of taking home to his family a large chunk of booty and setting up a monument in the town square in his honor. And you don't do that when you're fighting in the name of God Almighty. So Samuel, prophet of God, sets out to find a new king. He's not much interested in the job, figuring that Saul's CIA officers will probably follow him, but God tells him to take along a heifer and tell any potential informant on him that he's just off to Bethlehem to make a sacrifice. Suppressing his fears, Samuel goes, only to find that the elders of Bethlehem are no happier about his presence there than he is. If Samuel were still Saul's man, he would be scouting the area for contributions to his organ fund, or maybe it was a harp fund in those days. And if he'd lost favor with Saul, the Bethlehemites were in even greater danger for giving him refuge. Samuel had invited all the village elders of Bethlehem to participate in his heifer feast, but they quickly vanished into the night one by one, leaving only one elder still standing, Jesse, and his 7 sons. And Saul's eye is immediately drawn to one of them, tall, handsome, impressive Eliab, a lot like King Saul himself. But Samuel felt no impulse of the Spirit to choose him, so he moved on to the 2nd son, Abinadab, same result. 3rd son, Shammah, same thing. 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. Not a one of them struck him as the future ruler of Israel. Now, the number 7 in those days represented completeness. How come 7 sons and you can't find one among them, Samuel? So Samuel demands to know if that's all of them. To which Jesse responds, well, there's the kid, but he's with the sheep. Learning that a single younger brother remained, Samuel insists that he be brought, and insists that everybody stand and wait. Nobody sits down until the last son is called and comes. Samuel waits, Jesse waits, the brothers wait and wait. They await the arrival of David, the son who was not invited. And God told Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, for the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. We do tend to function like Samuel, do we not? We tend to judge inner character and beauty by outward appearance. And these boys look like leadership material to Samuel, strong, type A, assertive, take no prisoners, leaders. There's really this one sissy in the bunch, and he was writing songs and writing poetry and playing with the lambs on the back 40. And we still do we not, tend to, if we're not careful, confuse appearance for reality. It's almost trite to note that we live in a culture oriented to image and appearance. Products are sold by the appearance of youth and sexuality when these have nothing to do with the product at all. Children feel ostracized at school if they don't wear the right clothes or the right shoes. Politicians they spend millions to polish and project a successful media image way beyond dealing with the issues. I don't mean to be critical, but when you first saw Kucinich, didn't you know he didn't have a chance? I mean, did you look at his hair? Lincoln would have never made it out of Illinois. And in this kind of culture where appearance has become everything, it's no wonder our kids have problems with their own sense of themselves. Clearly the prevalence of anorexia in our culture as compared with others among young women, and the passion to bulk up among our young men, even to the point of steroids, has something to do with how they feel about themselves. Now, there's nothing wrong with a measure of concern for appearance. In fact, the teller of this old tale later concedes that David is a pretty good-looking fellow. Not quite what Michelangelo imagined, but good enough. But the point is this: when the culture elevates externals to the level where people take them as the real measure of who they are, when how we look and what we wear and where we live and how many symbols of success we can surround ourselves with, when these say increasingly who we are, we're in trouble. Because they don't do it. They don't really tell us who we are deep down inside, give us strength and beauty of soul. Barbara is brilliant and beautiful, though she would deny it. She'd been a model child. She never gave her parents any trouble, always seemed anxious to please. Anything less than an A in school sent her into a depression, but there weren't very many of them anyway. Everyone looked up to, admired Barbara, but no matter how well received she was and how hard she performed, she never seemed content with herself, almost as if she was looking for some affirmation that never came. She never could believe in the image that she had created. Partly it happens, I suppose, because of the signals we send to one another and to our children. A friend once wrote, "I do not think I've ever heard from my parents, 'I love you.' I've discussed it with my sister, and we agreed that our parents have never told us that we're clever or look nice, did well. It was always our failures that were talked about. If we didn't pass an exam, there was no encouragement. It'll be okay next time, or sorry. So I guess we have a lifetime to make up for it, it seems. It would have been nice to hear from time to time that when we do things right or have a dress that suits us, not to hear only, 'You look tired, that skirt is too short, it could not have been a good day for your hairdresser.'" In the comic strip Mama, Thomas asks, "Mama, how do you really feel about Tina?" That's his wife. Mama says, "Thomas, I'm surprised you have to ask. I love my daughter-in-law more dearly than I love any other opinionated, grasping, manipulative person in the world." And Thomas walks off muttering, "You know, with Mama, it's hard to tell positive from negative." Many of us got where we are because of the attitude of others, parents, buddy, teacher, stranger, attitudes that we bought into which are not helpful and healthy. Because they looked on the surface, they looked at the outward appearance, and they belittled or dismissed or put us down, and they forgot all about it, but we didn't. So we finished the job for them. We looked and saw what they saw and accepted the verdict. A few questions. How do you feel about your intelligence? It's an odd thing. I know a number of valedictorian types who protest that they are not brilliant, they're just overachievers. How do you feel about your appearance? Your weight, the shape of your nose, the amount of hair on your head? Can you live the rest of your days reasonably contented with the way these are, even when every other magazine and self-help book conspires to suggest that you're pretty substandard and need a major overhaul? Remember flipping through the photos they took at the last party or on the last trip? Remember the reaction when you came to the one with you in it? Was the invention of the camera really such a good idea after all? But the real point of this story is this: outward appearance is never the real story. It is not the real measure of us. God looks at what we are at heart. And what does he see? He sees human beings who are his creation and his children, who, if humble and open enough to him, he can use to shape and shake this world, whatever their pedigree or place or appearance or list of accomplishments. One of the most basic themes of the entire biblical message is that God finds possibilities in the most unexpected places and threw in the most unlikely persons. Moses is a stutterer. Jeremiah the prophet cannot speak. To choose the youngest son who labors as a shepherd to be Israel's future king is to ignore the usual arrangements of power and influence in the ancient world. Even the family tree of David is not distinguished. Jesse's grandmother was Ruth, an immigrant Moabite woman. His grandfather was Boaz, whose ancestors included a Canaanite woman who was almost executed for adultery. You see, in God's plan, sometimes, as Jesus puts it, the last are first. Even an absent eighth son tending sheep. And of course, the unlikely story of God working through the line of David leads where? Leads to Jesus. Jesus, born in a stable, a Galilean, a carpenter's son, finally a crucified criminal. The ancient prophet Isaiah had no idea what the Messiah would look like, the Messiah he hoped for. Nor do we have any idea what Jesus did in fact look like, which is probably all to the good. But I'm sure he probably did not look like Mel Gibson's Jesus. Indeed, the old prophet imagines that he would probably have no beauty at all, no majesty to catch our eyes, no grace really to attract us, an object from which people will turn away. But Jesus is the anointed in whom God meets us for the most unlikely of all moments of grace to convince us that it is not the estimate of the world around that really counts. It is not prominence. It is not appearance. It is not pedigree. I suppose no moment of the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta was more memorable than Kerri Strug's final vault in the team competition of women's gymnastics. The American team was poised to win the gold medal if either of the last two competitors succeeded in completing a clean vault. The vault did not have to be spectacular, but neither could the team afford any major deductions. The next to the last competitor attempted two vaults but fell on both of them, leaving it to Strug to clinch the gold medal. Now, Strug was not the best gymnast on the team, nor the flashiest, nor the most decorated. Before the Olympics, she was hardly known. When the tiny competitor raced down the floor to attempt her first vault, she slipped on the landing and injured her ankle. With one last chance remaining, she limped gingerly back to the starting line, testing her leg and fighting back pain and tears. She sprinted down the runway again, launched herself into a series of aerial gyrations, and executed a solid landing before reflexively lifting her injured foot and then collapsing in pain. With victory assured, the tiny but courageous gymnast was carried off the floor by her coach, placed on a stretcher, and wheeled to the medical center. Now, one could say that Kerri Strug made that final landing not with her feet, but with her heart. It wasn't the outward reputation or appearance that mattered, but the stuff she was made of, the stuff she found inside. But where does that stuff, that heart, that vitality, that strength come from? Our story ends, so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord gripped David with power. You see, it is those who are not full of themselves, either arrogance or even self-loathing, but it is those who are of humble estate, if you will, who are most often available to a power from God. Psychologist George Vaillant of Harvard University has studied human capacity over the years. He's interviewed thousands of people, and one of the conclusions that he's come away with is this: those who are strongest in life, those who are able to stand up against adversity and challenge, are those who experience a power as coming from outside to use for something bigger than themselves. He tells this story to illustrate his discovery. Some years ago, a 30-year-old musician afflicted with progressive deafness was debating suicide. He wrote to a friend that he was living an unhappy life, quarreling with nature and its creator, often cursing the latter for surrendering his creatures to the merest accident, which often breaks or destroys the most beautiful blossoms. Yet he begged his friend to keep the matter of my deafness a profound secret, to be confided to nobody, no matter what. To another friend he confessed one time, "For 2 years I've avoided almost all social gatherings because it's impossible for me to utter to others I am deaf. I've often cursed my creator, my existence." And if he fantasized about being abused by God, the flesh and blood father he who had created him had been a chronic alcoholic and had repeatedly over the years humiliated him. In fact, the following year, this musician composed a will in which his low self-esteem and suicidal ideation became more apparent still. How could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others? What humiliation for me when I stand next to someone who hears a flute in the distance and I hear nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that and I would have ended my life. We might legitimately ponder how such a musician would live out a full life. Certainly we could doubt that he would ever live to his full capacities. One might predict he might indeed one day take his life. Quarter of a century later, the musician was still alive and still involved in his art. Age 53 found him standing at the Royal Imperial Court Theater of Vienna, staring at the score of a symphony whose premiere he had just finished conducting. One of his soloists plucked his sleeve and directed his attention behind him to see what he could not hear: the clapping hands, the waving hats, the fluttering handkerchiefs. An observer recorded proudly in his own diary, "Never in my life have I heard such frenetic, loud cries." The miracle, of course, was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which Beethoven had chosen to set to Schiller's words, Ode to Joy. You see, 23 years before, Beethoven had written in his will, "As the leaves of autumn fall and are withered, so likewise has my own hope in life been blighted. O Providence, grant me at least but one day of pure joy. It's so long since real joy echoed in my heart." At one time, the progressively deaf musician had confessed a bargain that he had tried to make with his accursed creator. "Oh, if I were rid of this affliction, I would embrace the world." But the affliction did not disappear, it got worse. Nevertheless, the lyrics that the totally deaf Beethoven chose to put to music are, "Be embraced, all you millions, with a kiss for the whole world. Brothers, beyond the stars, surely dwells a loving Father." Professor Valiant says the miracle of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was the magic by which his heart had transformed an alcoholic and an accursed creator into a loving Father, who had indeed spun in him dross into gold, and not just for him, but for all generations. I sat with a woman last week who is dealing with physical and emotional challenges quite beyond belief, and I admired her strength. And she smiled and said, "I pray just about all day." To the heart that is open and humble and dependent upon God, He grants the power to embrace life and face whatever comes. Amen. Now, I should have selected a different hymn to close with. I should have selected 464. So that's the one we're going to sing.